Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am very, very excited to bring you a review of A Little Hatred by Joe Abercrombie. So if you've been on, around, near my channel over the past, like 3 or 4 months, you're probably well aware of the fact that not only is Joe Abercrombie one of my favorite authors, I've also been so incredibly excited for this book. It is the start of a brand new trilogy in the First Law world, and I was so pumped to read this. So I'm going to share my thoughts on this in a minute, but I wanted to go through kind of the disclaimers and then talk about one thing before we get started. So first things first, I was indeed sent a copy of this book, not this copy, this is my beautiful finished pre-ordered copy. I was sent a copy of this book for review by the publisher. I read a proof version of this book. However, that does not influence my opinion on this book whatsoever. This is also going to be a spoiler-free review for A Little Hatred and for the other books in the First Law world. And the thing that I think some people might be here for is whether or not you can read this without having read his other books first. And this is really subjective, I think. I personally would say no. I think you can read it and get a lot out of it and enjoy the story. All of the point of view characters are new. They're not old characters. However, there are a lot of characters from the original trilogy and from the standalone books, and there are a lot of new characters who are in some way related to those older characters. So his books have a huge cast always, and I think that if you're just throwing yourself in with this right away, you might be a little bit confused, a little bit lost. There are a lot of throwbacks and references to the other books. One of the plot lines in this book has a big spoiler for the end of the original trilogy. Like, there's a lot that ties into this book. Is it a standalone story? Absolutely. Will you get more out of it if you read the other books first? Definitely. So go ahead and choose whichever path you would like to take. So A Little Hatred takes place probably about 20 to 30 years after the end of the original trilogy, and the basically Industrial Revolution has come to the country. This is much more focused on industry and on a kind of Industrial Revolution narrative, whereas the original trilogy and the other books are much more kind of what you would think of like low fantasy. So the world is evolving, change has come, and a lot of this book is individuals dealing with that change, whether they are the very wealthy or the very poor. I've really only ever read one series that goes from kind of classic fantasy to Industrial Revolution type setting, which shall not be named, although it's like the best known fantasy series ever. I really did not enjoy that shift, so I was a little bit nervous about this because I have seen with that other series that this doesn't always work, and I love the kind of Industrial Revolution setting, but that kind of shift from one very specific type of fantasy to another very specific type of fantasy clearly doesn't always work. However, I thought that it was really fantastically done. The way that he continues to evolve this world, but also show the ways in which it is very much staying the same, is really fantastic. One thing that I really enjoyed is the fact that we see a lot of the North again. The North is my favorite sort of region in these books, and I really adore the North and the Northmen and kind of the warrior type culture. It's such a great juxtaposition against Ottawa, who's the main kind of other country that we have. And the two have been clashing constantly, and we are still kind of at the beginning, I guess, of a new conflict coming about in this book with Ottawa versus the North. I really love the way that in these conflicts, it's almost feels like a clash of the old versus the new, because the North has stayed very kind of traditional, I guess, in its own way. It doesn't feel like it's changed a whole lot, whereas Ottawa has all of these incredible new inventions and machinery and things coming about. So I really thought that the way that he did that was fantastic, and I always enjoy seeing kind of the two cultures clash in his books. There's also a completely new setting in this book that I really, really enjoyed, although enjoyed is possibly not quite the right word, because a lot of horrific things go down in a city called Valbec, which is basically one of these cities that sprung up with the industry, and there are all these horrible, horrible workhouses and factories, and living conditions are terrible, and it's a kind of a city that's ready to ignite as soon as someone sort of sets the spark of revolution. And the characters that are in that particular area, because everyone is spread out all across the country in this book, the characters in this particular area are really fascinating, and I feel like the really sort of poignant and impactful stuff from this book does come from the chapters in Valbec. So that's definitely something to keep an eye out for. I think that everything in that entire storyline is so good and so well done. In terms of characters, there are a lot of them. It's kind of something that you would expect with one of his books. I think there must be maybe 7 or 8 point of view characters, and there is a list of all of the characters and kind of what factions they're part of in the very back, which is very, very helpful and much appreciated. And I think that this is the main reason why I would say you should probably go ahead and read at least the First Law trilogy before you start this, because I think with so many characters, it's really hard to keep track. I was having trouble keeping track before I went back and read some of his other stuff before starting this book, and that really helped a lot. But knowing who is related to who, knowing who Savine's father is, knowing all about Jezzel, the king, and his son Orso, who's one of the main characters in this book, knowing who these people are is really, really helpful, because at least you have some context to place them in, and I think I would have struggled a little bit if I didn't have that. Something that I really appreciate about him and about his writing is the fact that women exist in his books. Although, to be fair, in the earlier books there are not as many women, he does a really good job of incorporating women into this book, and all of his women are always amazing, sometimes usually completely awful, super unlikable, which means that I adore them. And he does such a good job with all of his female characters in this book, particularly Savine. I have a very special place in my heart for Savine, even though she is a fucking nightmare. I adore her. She's a bad, bad person, and she's just fantastic. And I love her story arc throughout the story. Also really loved Ricky, who is the daughter of the Dogman, who again is someone from the previous books who you will know if you have read those. And she is a fantastic character as well. Very much a contrast to Savine, who's from Ottawa. She is from the north. I also, love is a really strong word, but I think that he is so good at writing absolute little shits. Some of his characters, usually the kind of characters who in a typical fantasy would be very heroic, are absolute little shits, and they're the worst, and I absolutely love to hate read them. So there are plenty of those kinds of characters, which again you'll be used to if you've read his other books. I thought that the cast is just so incredibly good, so incredibly well done, and I always appreciate kind of gray area characters. There are no real heroes in this story, there are no shining examples of goodness in this story. You are going to root for the bad people, you are going to adore the people who are just absolutely awful, and the characters who are meant to be kind of heroic and who inevitably usually get some kind of praise, usually for their sort of position in life, are going to be awful, and you're going to hate them. And it's just such a fantastic experience as a reader to read something different like that. Overall, I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. As you can probably tell, I absolutely adore his books and I adore his writing, as I have said multiple times, and this is absolutely no exception. I thought that it was incredibly well done. It just feels like one of his books. If you are a fan of his writing, if you're a fan of that humor mixed with the really, really grim stuff with the violence, then you will adore this. So there are some content warnings for it, just standard grimdark stuff, so lots of gore and violence and that sort of thing. So if grimdark is not necessarily your thing, I wouldn't say I'd recommend this, but if you'd like to get into grimdark, he is a great place to start because he is also incredibly painfully funny, and his writing is really easy to read. It flows really well, even though there are lots of complex storylines. So I would love to know if you have read A Little Hatred, if you are a fan of his books, if you've read his First Law books, if you have never read his stuff before but would like to give him a try. Give me a shout in the comments. I would love to chat with you. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.